Ever thought about what a company really is? You know, this legal thing that feels so solid? Well, what if it's just an empty shell? Today we're diving into this really fascinating idea in law called lifting the corporate veil. It's that moment when a court decides to tear down the wall and see who's actually pulling the strings. So let's get right into it. So let's start with a simple question. Can a company, this legal creation, just be used as a mask to hide behind? The short answer is yes, absolutely. But, and this is a big but, the law also says that sometimes that mask can be ripped right off. But before we get to taking the mask off, we've got to understand why it even exists. It all starts with something called the corporate shield, an idea that was hammered out in a huge landmark case way back in the 19th century. Okay, so here's the absolute bedrock of all company law. The second a company is legally created, it becomes its own person. No, really. It can own stuff, it can get into contracts, it can sue people, and it can be sued, all completely separate from the people who own it. This idea, the separate legal entity, is the wall that stands between a business's problems and the personal bank accounts of its owners.
And nothing tells the story better than the case of a guy named Mr. Solomon. So he has this successful leather business, and he decides to turn it into a company. He makes his family members the shareholders to tick all the legal boxes. But then, the business fails. The people the company owed money to were, well, furious. They said, "This company is a total sham. It's just Mr. Solomon in a wig. He should pay." But the highest court in the land said, nope. They ruled that Solomon & Co. Ltd. was its own legal person. The company's debts belonged to the company, not to him. And just like that, the corporate shield was born.
And this quote right here from Lord MacNaughton is what really sealed the deal. He basically said it doesn't matter if one person is running the whole show. If you followed the rules to create the company, it is separate, period. This decision is the reason we have limited liability today, the very thing that encourages people to invest and start businesses without risking everything they own.
Right, but what happens when that shield isn't used to grow a business, but to commit fraud, or to just dodge your responsibilities? Well, this is where the law had to come up with a clever exception: the power to peek behind the veil.
Now this slide really lays out the fundamental tug of war here. On one side, you've got the rule from the Solomon case: a company is its own person, which protects owners and makes people want to invest. But on the other side, you have the exception: lifting the veil. This is when the courts say, hold on, and they ignore that separation to make the owners personally responsible. And they do that for one big reason: to stop fraud and prevent injustice.
Now, it's not always a judge who decides to break through that shield. Sometimes Parliament steps in and writes laws that give the courts very specific instructions and tools to get the job done. And lawmakers gave the courts two really powerful tools for this, which you can think of as a couple of statutory hammers. They're designed to crack the corporate shield when a company is going under. The first is called fraudulent trading, which is for flat-out, deliberate dishonesty. But the second, and much more common one, is called wrongful trading.
So wrongful trading is interesting because you don't have to prove someone was being intentionally crooked. The test is pretty straightforward. 1, did a director know, or should they have reasonably figured out, that the company was doomed and couldn't avoid going bust? 2, if so, did they just keep trading anyway? If the answer to both is yes, a court can step in and make that director use their own money to help pay off the company's debts. It's a huge reality check for reckless behavior.
So, beyond the rules that Parliament wrote down, judges have also developed their own power to lift the veil over the years, especially when they see a company being used as, and these are their words, a facade or a sham.
Okay, check this out. There's this guy, Mr. Horn. He leaves his job, but he signed a contract that says he can't go off and compete with his old employer. So what does he do? He sets up a new company to do the competing for him. And he argued, hey, it's not me competing, it's the company. As you can imagine, the court saw right through that. They called his company a mere cloak or sham and shut him down.
And then you have Mr. Lippman. He agrees to sell some land, but then he changes his mind, probably got a better offer. So, to wiggle out of the deal, he quickly creates a company and sells the land to it. Then he says, sorry, can't sell you the land, I don't own it anymore. Again, the court was having none of it. They called the company a facade and forced the land to be sold. You see the pattern here? In both cases, the company was just a tool to dodge a legal promise they'd already made.
But then came Adams v. Cape Industries. In this case, changed the game. It was a huge, complex situation. A UK parent company was using other companies, or subsidiaries, in the US to run its asbestos business.
Workers in the US got sick and won their court cases. They then came to the UK to try and get their money from the parent company, but the court here refused to lift the veil. They basically said that setting up your companies to protect yourself from future problems isn't by itself a good enough reason to break the shield. This case built a much higher wall around the company.
And that brings us right up to the modern day. After all those years of different cases and a bit of confusion, the Supreme Court finally stepped in to lay down the law, creating a much stricter, much more precise test for when that corporate shield can actually be pierced.
The big case you need to know about is Petrodel v. Prest, and funnily enough, it was a divorce case. A very wealthy husband had put a ton of valuable properties into his companies, and then, during the divorce, he claimed they weren't his personal assets to give to his wife. This whole mess forced the Supreme Court to finally define exactly when a court is allowed to ignore a company's separate identity.
And this table here really gets to the heart of it. The court came up with two very different principles. First, there's the concealment principle. This just means a court can always look through a company to figure out what's really going on, like who's actually in charge. But, and this is key, this doesn't break the shield. The second one, the evasion principle, is the big one. This applies only when someone uses a company specifically to get out of a legal obligation they already have. Think back to Mr. Horn and Mr. Lippman. The court said it is only in this very specific, very narrow situation that the veil can truly be pierced.
So, after over 100 years of legal battles, from a small leather business to massive multinational corporations, we've seen this journey from creating a shield to testing its limits and now to seriously reinforcing it. It's become clear that courts are incredibly hesitant to pierce that veil. They're saving that power for only the most blatant cases where someone is trying to evade the law. Which kind of leaves us with one final thought, doesn't it? Is the corporate veil, the very shield designed to protect business, now stronger than it has ever been?